Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the best practices for mailboxes, aliases, and Google Groups. This webinar is aimed at businesses currently on Google Workspace, but the factors we discuss may be considered by any administrator on any email provider. A couple of quick technical points. If you have any questions as the webinar goes on, please do pop them in the chat. We have a team kind of behind us who will answer them as we go, or we'll come to them at the end. And also, if you see us look off screen, it is because we have some handy people helping us behind the scenes. Your presenters are myself, Erica Schofield. My current role is Enterprise Special Projects, and I've been with Open Networks since 2002, on and off. And my job primarily is to be able to talk to business requirements and try and match the technologies we offer to solving business needs. And I'm introducing my colleague who is incredible at ensuring that tech works reliably and at scale, Barbara.
My cue. So my name is Barbara Kettner. I'm a Google collaboration engineer. I haven't been with Open Networks since 2002, but I have been here a fairly long time. I've been doing Google implementations since about 2012. So in that time, I think, Erica, you and I, we've seen a whole raft of changes, not least of which is at least 3 name changes. I think we started off with Google Apps, then went to G Suite, and are currently sitting on Google Workspace.
So if we do still refer to G Suite by accident, it's just showing our wealth of experience. And that experience is often hard won. It often includes sort of quite difficult things. So we understand the pressure that administrators are under when things do go wrong. Barbara, what's your worst email memory?
Yeah. So I inadvertently managed to send an email to our entire client database. I think luckily the email was blank, rather blank than saying something ridiculous. But yes, that wasn't the highlight. I think you've done something similar.
I did something similar. It wasn't blank, though. It was a completely dark email, and it was an invitation to VIPs of the level of presidents and politicians. So it was a difficult experience. And Open Networks, who we're representing today, we strive to make cutting-edge collaboration and cloud softwares available to businesses and very accessible, and essentially to increase your efficiency, and I always like to think to increase the enjoyment of your workdays. So maybe this webinar can help. Barbara, why are we here today specifically?
Well, our support team gets lots of questions about how to set up email addresses, and they also get a lot of queries about when things go wrong. So we wanted to share some information about how to set email addresses up and some of the best practice surrounding that. In particular, we wanted to touch on the situation, or as we referred to it in the slide, the suicidal practice of where multiple users use the same mailbox. And by this, I mean multiple users have the same username and password and use those credentials to log into the same mailbox.
There's my little elephant going, why is it so bad? We call them elephants in the room because you can ignore certain things in setup and everything works absolutely fine and seems fine until suddenly it's not, and you're sitting in the middle of a security breach. Especially recently at Open Networks, we've seen an increase in phishing and cyber attacks. And of course, the POPI Act came into full effect this year. So for business, definitely it's placed security as a #1 item on their agenda.
Yeah, I mean, technical teams have always had it as #1 on their agenda, just because we do know that the business users like to share passwords occasionally.
Okay. And because email has become such a gateway to improving control and security for a company, we'll also outline a few tips before we kick off and some lookouts around the setup of company email. But first, let's literally spend some time with some of those elephants, using that example of multiple users sharing an inbox. The first is we've already highlighted is security and POPI compliance. Also, what can happen is sharing inboxes causes confusion. So did I send that rude email to the client or did you? And we don't know.
Yes, one of the other things to look out for from a technical point of view in this scenario is that Google actually has a bunch of smart tools designed around email security, in particular around stopping phishing attacks or hacking attacks. So if you have multiple people and numerous logins to the same email account in a relatively short period of time, and in particular if they're coming from different IP addresses, those can be flagged as suspicious logins. And then as a security measure, the account can be locked out temporarily, but just to stop any suspected bad behavior. The other thing to bear in mind is that an account, it's not just a mailbox that you're sharing when you give away a password. There's mail in there, and with Workspace, you have all different services like Drive and Sites and Chat. But you can also use your Google account credentials as a single sign-on for other applications. And therefore, you can inadvertently give access to a whole lot more than you bargained for. And lastly, there can be issues when people leave the company. So either the password gets changed and everybody gets logged out because that change has not been communicated, or the password isn't changed and someone still has access to what they shouldn't have access to. And even before then, passwords can cause an issue because you just need one user to forget that they forget their password and ask for a password reset, and then again manage to lock everyone else out.
I done it. So as promised, some of those elephant catches, before you start setting up groups and things, there are a few things you can do to make sure that your email is as secure as possible for a business. Kind of two aspects, one dealing with your users and the other behind the scenes setup. So with users, I mean, you'll hear it everywhere. It's imperative to have two-step verification set up for them. And we also recommend have a set and planned process for start of turnover from the get-go.
And then from a data protection point of view, there are a number of things you can do via the admin settings to prevent data leakage. So first, just looking at the ways that data leakage can happen. One of them is automatic email forwarding. A user can either forward all email or certain email to another account and possibly to a competitor. And those emails can contain sensitive information around pricing. And this is in fact a scenario that has happened to a client of ours before. Happened to be before they moved to Google, but it can also happen in Google. So you can either, in the admin settings, not allow automatic forwarding at all, but sometimes there are use cases where it's very convenient to allow it. Then at least you should set up some alerts to let you know when a forwarding address has been added, and then you can actually interrogate that email address and ask the user what that's needed for. Then another way to stop the data leak is, depending on what license SKU you have, you can set up DLP rules, so data loss prevention rules. These rules are ones that you set up to scan inbound and outbound email for sensitive information, and then you can take action on those emails to either block them or to quarantine them. Then Takeout is a tool that Google provides that allows you to download all of your Google data. I mean, it's really useful in certain circumstances, but again, is a danger to information leaking out. And you should in the admin console block the ability of your users to do a takeout as a default. And lastly, you should also disable IMAP connections for your users. Again, something you do in the admin console. Imy Protocol is a protocol that allows applications to get access to messages in the mailbox. So for instance, if you want to use an email client like Outlook, you would use IMAP to get those messages, but then that user actually has a local copy of all those messages on their computer. And again, very handy file just to pass on to a competitor. And the last thing we just want to mention here around elephant catches is Vault. So again, whether you have Vault will depend on what license SKU you have. Vault is an email archiving and e-discovery tool and retains all your organization's emails in a separate repository, and even if users will delete their emails, whether it's done on purpose or by mistake. In order for Vault to be operational, not only do you have to have the license for Vault, but you must also set up retention rules. So it's really good practice to go and check that those are set up correctly from time to time. especially as Vault has evolved over the time and doesn't only retain copies of email, it also does things like chat and drive documents. So those are a couple of things that we've mentioned now, just around specifically email security. We did actually do a whole webinar about security and security compliance in the workspace space a couple of months ago. So we're going to pop that link into the chat, and then if you're interested, you can go and have a look at that.
So now on to setting groups and aliases and mailbox setup. So Google Workspace and Google's recommended best practice is one user to have one Google Workspace account. And it's the Workspace account, which is your email address, is your key to all the apps within the Google Workspace ecosystem. So sites, forms, docs, and sheets. And you'll find all those apps behind that little thing in your inbox that we call the waffle, because it looks like a delicious waffle. And again, to know more, we had a What's Behind the Waffle seminar. So we'll also pop that one in the chat so you can watch and see if you'd like to know more there. But essentially, your ultimate best practice is one user, one Google Workspace account.
And on top of that, our recommendation is that the email address for that account actually consists of the user's name. So Erica at Open Networks or Barbara at Open Networks, instead of using a generic username that might describe the job designation of the person. So often we see email addresses like sales1 at or store manager 123 at. And so our reasoning behind using the actual person's name is that there is no such thing as a generic account. The account is always personal to the person using it. So if you think about HR communication, and an email is obviously a tool that you would use for that, is things like salary slips are sent, or if unfortunately there's a disciplinary procedure, any communication around that. Right, so when we set up email addresses, essentially we have 3 items in our toolkit. So the first is quite simple. I think everyone knows it. It's your Gmail, your actual Gmail mailbox, and that's what all of you will be familiar with. Then we have a delegated mailbox, and that is really just a mailbox that you can grant other users access to. It's sometimes also referred to as a shared mailbox. The final, or the third thing, is a group, which is one email address through which you can reach multiple people. And then, along with these sort of basic building blocks, we have other tools that can help handle email or email flow. There are things like email aliases, email forwarding, and send as functionality. So as we go through this webinar, we will share a little bit on how and where you can set these up.
So to look at the different ways you might use them, we've painted some different scenarios that sort of common company communication will handle. And this is our first, technically the most simple. One person, one email. Life really should be so simple until life does happen. For example, somebody gets married, or there was a typo when they set up the address. Or from a business point of view, a business might have different domains, a .com and .coza. It's quite common. Or business handles different brands, but the same users perform the same roles. So we love sweets.coza or we love biscuits.coza.
Right, so in these cases, our tool is an email alias, which is essentially being able to add an additional email address to a user account. So email aliases allow users to receive emails sent to those additional addresses. But what a lot of people are not aware of is that you can also send email from that alias, or actually any other email address you own. So in the scenario that Erica just painted, this is really useful if you're wearing multiple hats or you have multiple brands. So you're Bob at welovesweets.coza, but you also need to represent as Bob welovebiscuits.coza. The email alias is set up in the admin console, whereas the send as functionality is actually set up in the user settings. So in the user settings, you can also stipulate that when you reply to an email, it is sent from the same address to which the message was originally sent. So if an email is sent to Bob at welovebiscuits, then he can automatically reply from address being Bob at welovebiscuits.
And here's a fun one. We often remind users to have a look at the settings available to them in their Gmail. In this example, someone's definitely found the pretty background. But in the example of multiple brands, a really handy tool is you can separate into different visual boxes those two different email addresses. And so it just makes handling two different emails a little bit easier. The next, quite simple, very common business scenario is where an email inbox workload is shared. Most common probably is example, perhaps of a C-level executive and their personal assistant, or where a colleague is off work for a temporary amount of time. In the example of PAs and business users, it's often where we see shared password crimes, because as much as it's recommended that you don't use the same password in different scenarios, many people do. And your PA may inadvertently have access to your PayPal account, to your bank account, to your favorite doggy shampoo buying website account. Delegated inbox kind of helps with this scenario.
Yeah, so as Eric has mentioned, the solution is a delegated mailbox, which we've already mentioned is a mailbox where access is granted to another user. And this is done through the user's Gmail account settings. So the user doesn't share the password to their account, they just give access in the settings, and they can then also remove access without having to change their password. In their settings, they can also specify what the sender information should look like. So you can you can choose whether it shows the actual account that you're sending from and the person who sent it. So it will have a sent by in brackets behind it, or whether you only show the original account address. The one thing just to mention about the delegated inbox is that you're giving access to everything in the mail account. So you can't just limit it to what's in the inbox or limit it to what's in certain folders. So you are potentially giving access to confidential information. So either really trust the person or you might look at a different solution.
And then when you are working together in a delegated inbox, the place you find it is in your own Gmail inbox. Click on you can see Barbara's little face there up in the right corner, and it'll just list itself underneath to access the other colleague's inbox. It's also probably a good idea to note that delegated inbox gives you access to the mail only. So there's no sharing of Drive, and you can share calendar, but you would do that within calendar settings and not here.
So just on a sort of technical side note, in order to set up a delegated mailbox or to allow your users to set up delegated mailboxes, you first have to enable it in the admin console. So just remember to do that.
Another very common scenario is to reach a whole team by typing in a single email address. Like for us at Open Networks, we have team at Open Networks, and here's Anna asking us to follow up on our quarterly goals. Excuse me. There's no need here for responses to be seen by all, but there are a few factors that you do need to consider.
Yeah, so the solution here is a Google group, and this is the typical application that most people were familiar with as a group. So it's it's group as a distribution list. And all users that need to receive the email are added as members of the group. And mail sent to the group address is delivered to each individual team member's mailbox. So essentially everyone's getting their own copy of the email. When you are setting up distribution lists, you may just want to pay attention to some of the group settings. For instance, you may want to restrict who can actually post to the group. So this is probably really recommended when you have large groups. So if you have a whole company at group address and there are hundreds of people, you might want to only limit it to certain people being able to post to the group. This kind of stops the needless reply all sort of meaningless thank you responses, and also can prevent the whole company from being spammed with unwanted invitations to Tupperware parties from Mavis and accounting. The other setting you can look at and should be aware of is that you can allow email addresses and people external to your company. So you can use a group to also not just be a company-wide tool, but potentially include contractors or suppliers on a particular matter. Again, this is something you have to switch on or block in the email settings. And then there's a useful setting that allows you to archive everything, all the incoming mails from the Google group. So if you want to have a kind of a backlog of all the emails sent to that group, you can switch on the archive option, and it could be useful to refer back to at some point.
Now we come to the scenario that inspired this webinar, and the one that leads to most elephants in the room. A group of people needing to work off the same mailbox. A very common example would be a support email address. And while the bad news is that there isn't one right way to do it, the good news is there are a couple of good options, and we'll take you through two of them. What it does depend on is what your business needs out of that particular scenario. So these are the two tools we'd recommend to look at for approaching the scenario. And these are some of the questions you need to consider before setting it up. Do your users need to see the email history? Does everyone need to see the responses? Do you need to assign specific emails in a certain way? The two tools would be Google Groups or Delegated Mailbox. Once again, Google Groups are quite popular because they are free to set up, and you can add users to the group from outside of the company, like perhaps contractors. However, the Delegated Mailbox has advantages around productivity and future-proofing, even though it's got a little bit more cost. But I'll hand over to Barbara to go into more depth on both of these tools.
So first, if we take a look at Google Groups, we've already spoken about Google Groups as a distribution list. And you could use that here, but just remember, everyone gets their own copy of the email in their mailbox. So you would need an additional process to make it clear to users who's actually going to deal with the mail. So maybe you have something like shift workers, and if it's in your shift and the email comes in, you're the person to deal with it. That could work then. So it really is about having a process to allocate responsibility for the mail, and that person then takes over the full responsibility of dealing with that issue and runs with it. What you don't end up with is a sort of a separate repository of all those emails that other people can look at. But it has the advantage that users can work from within their own mailbox, and there's one place to look. But probably when we're looking at groups, the functionality you want to look at is a collaborative inboxing group. So this is a group set up with particular settings. It relies on the archive option that I mentioned earlier on. And users actually work from the Google Groups interface and not from their inbox. So the Groups interface is accessed using the waffle that we've also referred to, and which is in the top right hand of your hand corner of your account. And you are then taken to a new tab on groups.google.com. So the advantages of using a collaborative inbox group is that you do end up with a separate repository of emails. So you can see all the email correspondence related to that email address in one place, the responses, etc. Is an important proviso to that is that you have to set up get the group settings correct, and also make sure that users use it correctly. What nice feature of the collaborative inbox, though, is that you can assign conversations to people and actually track conversations or emails that come in as tasks. So some of the disadvantages, though, is that, at least in my opinion, the groups interface is a bit more clunky, and at the very least, it's unfamiliar to users. It looks different to the Gmail inbox. You don't have labels and folders the way that you do have in your inbox. Also no filters. So that's a new training requirement for users. And the other disadvantage is that it is possible for emails to wander outside of that kind of group, of that collaborative inbox. So the user can end up receiving the email in their own inbox and responding from there, and then it takes the conversation into their personal mailbox. Or they respond with the wrong address in the collaborative inbox, and again, then after that, all responses come back into their own inbox. The other option is the delegated mailbox, which we have discussed a few times now. So the really big advantage of this is that it keeps all of the email communications separate from from other personal emails or other people, the actual individual's user accounts, and it keeps it all together, all the conversations, responses, etc., that have come in surrounding those emails. And it is secure, as we've already mentioned. If someone leaves, they will lose access to that delegated mailbox as soon as they lose access to their own account. The disadvantages are, unfortunately, that it does cost an additional license. It is essentially another mailbox, and there are 2 places that a user needs to go and sort of check for emails, although that's the same for a Google Group collaborative inbox.
I think we all have our favorites. Barbara, what would your preference be for multiple users, one email address?
So my personal preference, or I think which is cleaner and neater and easier for users to use, is actually the delegated mailbox. It's a familiar interface. You've got your labels, you've got your filters, everything stays in one place.
Nice. Thank you. In another scenario, where I imagine delegated inbox will be one of the good options, is where there's a specified role, so one email address, with only one person monitoring it, but it is a generic role like manager at or sales at. So I do work with an NGO. They have a manager at the NGO's name, but the actual person who's managing does turn over sort of on a yearly basis, and that history is needed in that inbox.
Yeah, so one person dealing with the emails as they come in, it seems it's a really simple problem to solve, because you can just add an alias to that person's account. But when doing so, you do need to think about the future impact. So Eric has already mentioned staff turnover. One person might be dealing with it right now, but in future could be someone else. Or the team can grow and you need more people to respond to those emails, and then actually you need a separate place for it. So if you are thinking that that might be the scenario, in that case, you might want to set up a delegated mailbox from the start as a separate mailbox and give access via the delegation procedure. Again, obviously, there's a cost involved to this, but it does kind of future-proof that for future teamwork.
And our final scenario for today, very common one, staff leaving, staff turnover. When employees leave permanently, it's often when all the choices you've made on mail handling so far come into play. So we've made a very kind of high-level overview of some of the options you can take when a staff member leaves. There is no one correct option, but as usual, you need to consider your business-based questions. So are there business functions that need to carry on with this email address? Will they need to be taken over? And very importantly nowadays, data. Is there a need to retain the data for legal or business purposes? Will you need an audit trail? How long will you need to keep that data? So Barbara, the staff turnover slide, chat us through it, please.
Yeah, so I think if you take away anything from the slide is the very noticeable big red star-shaped splodge, sort of in the middle. And the first thing you want to do, obviously, if staff leave, is to remove access for that user. So the easiest way to do that is to reset the password on the account. The other option you could do is to actually suspend the account. Just bear in mind, if you suspend the account, then you can't set up things like out of offices to give automatic responses, this user has left, please contact, etc. Type of out of office response. And in fact, all emails to that account will bounce. So you don't have a way of dealing with ongoing business in that. So on the question, though, sort of specifically about who and how business function needs to be taken over, or how it should be taken over, can be. The first question you need to ask, does the person who's taking over the function need to see all of the historic mail and all the context that goes along with it, and then refer to it on a daily basis? Or do they just need to see the new email coming in and deal with it going forwards? So if it's the former, and you need the new user to be able to see everything in the mailbox and all the history, then you've got options to either rename the leaving employee's account to the new user's account, or you can migrate certain information from the old user, the leaving user, to the new user. So just to bear in mind, if you rename an account, you're basically giving the whole account to the new person, is that you're giving all the information with it. So again, that scenario about your personal account will, even though it's work, you still receive personal information in it, and particularly around HR, so personal but work-related. So you need to be very careful about just renaming an account and handing it over to someone else, although it's a very popular option. The other option, if you are concerned there's a lot of other stuff in that mailbox that you can't just hand it over to someone new, is you can actually migrate some of that mail from the leaving user's mailbox into the new employee's mailbox. And the advantage of migration is that you can migrate perhaps only certain folders. It does mean, however, that you need to possibly go into the old account and reorganize or make sure that all the information is in certain folders. So that's if you need the incoming user to be able to see everything that's gone on in the past. If you don't need that, then you just need the new user to see all the emails going forwards. Then you can either sort of reallocate just the email address or redirect emails coming to that email address. So reallocating the user's email address, you could actually add the old employee's email address as an alias onto the new person's account. So they will receive all the emails that now come in to that email address. Or if you don't want to add an alias, you can set up various redirect mail flow options in the admin console. You could set up a compliance rule that says if any email comes into this address, please also send to that person. Or there's a functionality called recipient address mapping, which allows you to map two names together. So if it sends to that, if it comes into that email address, then also send a copy to that email address. And then that user will get everything going forwards. So that's handing over business functions and dealing with what's in the account. On the question of data retention with the leaving employee, pretty much simple about, there's one question you need to ask: do you need to keep it or not? So if you need to keep the data for compliance reasons or business continuity, etc., what you can do is use a archive license. So this is a cheaper option than actually keeping the whole mailbox active. So if you had a full Workspace account, you would pay more, but with the archive license, you only access the email in Vault. So you do need to set up access for whoever needs to be able to go look at Vault, or it has to be, perhaps, this is a scenario where someone doesn't need access very often, but it is cheaper. Alternatively, of course, if you don't need the data and you're sure you don't need the data, you can delete the account, but delete means delete. So if you click on delete, it's gone. I think you have 25 days to restore a user account, but after that, it's gone. What you could do there is perhaps do a download or a takeout of that particular account and keep it just in case somewhere. But then you have to consider options about where am I going to keep it? Is it secure? And all the things that surround POPI requirements as well.
Brilliant, thank you. So thank you very much for joining us on this journey through a few different scenarios. These are the kind of a little summary of the 3 mail tools that you have on offer with Google Workspace and the different places you might want to use them. We are just checking if any questions came through, and if you have any questions now, do pop them into the chat box. Or if you have a specific scenario you'd like us to brainstorm, just mail us on support@opennetworks.com and maybe we can help you out. And really, yeah, we appreciate you joining it, and we wish you much happy emailing.
Yeah, I see there are a couple of questions, but it looks like most of them have been answered in the chat. There's one, actually, I think I answered it in the webinar itself. If an employee leaves, can I assign his email address as an alias to an existing employee? Yes, you can. So that's what I mentioned just now. Technically around that, if you want to add it as an alias, it cannot exist as an email account or an email address anywhere else. So if you delete the account of the old user leaving, easy peasy, alias on the new account. If you don't want to delete it because you're trying to retain all the data in it, what you can do is rename that account to old Bob at We Love Biscuits, for instance, and then add the correct alias to the new user. And like I say, there is another way around that by just redirecting the emails to that. Right, I think not seeing anything else that hasn't been answered yet.
Brilliant. So I've been dying to do this whole webinar. I'm just going to wave at Barbara. And thank you for joining us. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.